welcome to the Luke Lunchtime Takeaway. Week by week we're going through Luke's Gospel and we're looking at the words and claims and miracles of Jesus as he makes his journey towards his cross and his resurrection. Well, now that the clocks have gone back, it's time, as winter darkness begins to set in, to think about light. And light is a great encouragement to us in the darkness, isn't it? Light was a metaphor that Jesus used very often in the Bible, and he uses it here in Luke 11 very powerfully. He talks about healthy light. It's an unusual sort of concept, that, isn't it? Healthy light shines into our minds, into our hearts, and it leads us, it guides us, it gives us wisdom for life. On the other hand, Jesus also in this chapter shines a searchlight into the religious hypocrisy of the Pharisees, the religious leaders of his time. We'll come to that. Let's get this idea of light shining in our lives first. Listen to these words of Jesus in verse 34. Your eye is the lamp of your body. When your eye is healthy, your whole body is full of light. But when it is bad, your body is full of darkness. Now, of course, very obviously, that's a very powerful picture of the importance of eyesight. But Jesus is using it in a spiritual sense. Remember that he says in John chapter 8, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. If we put our trust in Jesus, if we allow God's truth to come into our hearts and our minds, and we receive it and we believe it, it is like filling our lives with light and wisdom to guide us and to see the world in a wholly different way. If we look at the world as God's world, made by God for his glory, God's light shines into every part of our perception of that world and our understanding of ourselves. If, on the other hand, we drive God's truth away, we resist the light, we refuse to trust in Jesus, what a limited, small-minded darkness takes over us, thinking that this life is all that there is and thinking that we don't need God to explain it to us. What an incredibly self-centered attitude that is. Now, for some people, that darkness shows itself in terms of complete atheism. They don't want God in their lives. They don't believe any of it's true, and they push God away in that way. For other people, there's a sort of pragmatic atheism. On the surface, they say, yes, I'm a believer, I'm religious, I worship God, I go to church and so on. But actually, underneath that external veneer, there is no change. And that's why in the rest of this chapter 11 of Luke's Gospel, Jesus, if you like, shines a searchlight into the hypocrisy of the religious leaders' lives. And it's a very striking passage for the kind of things that Jesus says about them. Listen to these words. Verse 39, Now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. The Pharisees, the religious leaders, were concerned about keeping the external rules of the law and the traditions of Israel. So they wanted to keep up a religious appearance. When it came to all the cups that they washed and drank from, they wanted to make sure that the outside was clean. But on the inside, in their hearts, they weren't concerned about their greed. They weren't concerned about their selfishness. Nothing had changed. Their hearts were still filled with darkness. When they went out into the garden to pick some herbs, they kept the law of tithing by taking 10% of their herbs and giving them to the synagogue leaders. But they didn't give to the poor. They didn't care about the poor. So it was just purely symbolic and external, and it didn't change their lives. When they went to the synagogue, they loved the best seats in the synagogue. They wanted everybody to see they were there. But they weren't repenting, they weren't changing. Nothing in their hearts was any different. The darkness was still in charge. Jesus also talks to the teachers of the law, the people who taught the religious leaders the real meaning and interpretation of the religious laws of Moses. And the teachers of the law had put a heavy burden on other people. They've made the laws of Moses almost impossible to keep. And yet they themselves didn't keep the law. What total hypocrisy. And they made a big impression in a particular way. They knew where some of the prophets were buried, and in those days they had gone and built very impressive tombs to celebrate these prophets who were dead many centuries before. But the same people who did that, if they had been around when the prophets were alive, they wouldn't have listened to a word that the prophets would have said. In fact, they would have been on the side of the people who were ganging up to kill them. So what total hypocrisy that is. And if you like, their hypocrisy acted as a barrier to prevent other people from coming to God. Now, if that all seems a long time ago, and what does that have to do with us? I want to say it has everything to do with us. We live in a deeply hypocritical culture. Our society is taken up with its virtue signaling, isn't it? And it's all about external things. There are phrases and words that you must not say because they're no longer politically correct. There are things that you don't buy. There are businesses that you must not patronize because they've been blackballed and boycotted. There are foods that you must prove your virtue with by choosing not to eat. There are campaign badges that you've got to wear to show that you're on side. And on your social media, you've got to line up all the hashtags to prove your virtue, that you're backing all these campaigns. And yet, people are more horrible to each other than they've ever been. This is a really horrible time to be living through, isn't it, in terms of the bile that people throw at each other. There is more evil, there is more violence, there is more injustice than ever. However politically correct we are, it's an empty hypocrisy. And we need the light of Jesus to shine into our lives. We need to let the truth of God shine into our lives and inform our minds and change our hearts. We need to receive the grace of God in Jesus, that he receives us in spite of who we are, and he cleanses away our sin by taking it to his cross and being punished in our place. And we must allow the darkness of our lives to be exposed by the light of Jesus, to let his light and truth shine into our minds, to change our thinking and change our whole perspective on the world, and shine into our hearts to change our desires and our attitudes. The grace of God can change us, and it can radically transform this world. If you've never discovered the grace of God before and you'd like to know more, do drop us an email. The email will appear on the screen, and we'd love to give you a copy of Luke's Gospel so you can read the whole Gospel for yourself. If you live near Didcot, just drop us an email and we'll happily deliver a copy to your door. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again next time.